relations with China are historical relations. They're revolutionary relations. We related to China for a long, long time during our struggle before our independence. But we will be talking about how we can together once again help each other so the fruits of what we fought for together can be yielded by yet another struggle, joint struggle, but this time a peaceful and economic struggle for our people.
And to start this revolution, he's dispatched his second-in-command. Zimbabwean Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa is on an official visit to China to discuss relations between the countries before signing a historic MOU between the two ruling parties. But while China-Zimbabwe trade grew to $1.24 billion in 2014, economic growth in the South African nation is still slowing year on year. So, could better relations with China turn the economy around? And what else can we expect as Zimbabwe looks east? I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. Zimbabwean Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa is on a week-long official visit to China, where he is expected to sign several bilateral agreements. Now, here's some background to Mnangagwa's visit, coming nearly a year after President Robert Mugabe's state visit to China in 2014. Zimbabwe needs about $14.2 billion to rehabilitate existing infrastructure and develop new capacity to meet growing demand, and that's according to the African Development Bank. However, Zimbabwe doesn't have this kind of money. And this is why. Sometime in the 1990s, Zimbabwe was on the path to middle-income status. Then it slumped into nearly 2 decades of political instability and economic turmoil, thanks largely to Western-led economic sanctions. Now, during this period, Zimbabwe's GDP declined by 96%, triggering hyperinflation. And in 2009, the country was forced to adopt the US dollar along with a handful of other foreign currencies as it embarked on a period of stabilization and growth ushered in by a political settlement. Now, the period between 2009 and 2012 saw Zimbabwe's economy rebound, with growth rates averaging around 8.7%. As inflation stabilized, revenues and bank deposits recovered sharply. But since 2012, the economy has experienced a dramatic slowdown owing to deteriorating terms of trade, adverse weather, and increasing policy instability. Now, growth slowed to 4.5% in 2013. 3.2% in 2014 and is projected at 2.8% this year. So, why exactly is the Vice President in Beijing? Now, last year, Zimbabwe and China signed 9 landmark agreements that were expected to unlock much-needed funding for the country's energy, roads, national railway network, telecommunications, agriculture, and tourism sectors. But the question is, what is the current status of these agreements, and how can China contribute to Zimbabwe's agenda for sustainable socio-economic transformation? Here's CCTV's Farai Mokotuya with more.
Just under a year ago, President Robert Mugabe and his counterpart Xi Jinping signed a series of agreements that promised billions of investment dollars into projects including energy, transport, and telecommunications. They are at various stages of implementation. Last year, President Mugabe commissioned the expansion of the Kariba Dam hydropower plant, which will increase power generation capacity by 300 megawatts. A $1.1 billion expansion of Zimbabwe's biggest power plant in Hwange is also underway and is being done by Sino-Africa Hydro. But some of the deals are yet to be consummated, and that's left locals anxious. Zimasset, the country's 5-year economic turnaround plan, remains largely unfulfilled as the country hangs on for funding. That could be why Vice President Mnangagwa, tipped by many as Mugabe's successor, has been dispatched to Beijing.
Indeed, he is in China at the moment, and among the deals that he is trying to look at and accelerating are the deals that were signed when His Excellency the President visited China last year. And one of them is obviously the $218 million broadband facility that we got from Exim Bank for Net One. So we're looking at fast-tracking the implementation, growing the business of Net One, and therefore potentially investing more and talking to the Chinese for more investment. But we're not just looking for investment in mobile broadband. We are looking for investment including in putting up a national fiber backbone. We're talking to many Chinese investors, and the Vice President will be looking at how to advance those interests.
And it looks like the mission is bearing fruit. State media has reported that a memorandum of understanding for the accelerated implementation of Zim Asset has already been signed on this visit. This could open the door for further investment flows from China into the local economy that has been starved of fresh capital.
They are a major funder of contract tobacco farming. They are a major buyer of that tobacco. They are a major investor in the mining sector, both in terms of mining itself and in terms of beneficiation or processing of some of the minerals. And chrome is one instance where they have Chinese investment has come in even setting up furnaces or refineries.
Trade between the two countries exceeded $1 billion in 2014 and is set to grow further this year as the implementation of the cooperation agreements is stepped up on the back of this high-level visit. Farai Mwakutuya, CCTV, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Now, Mnangagwa's visit is his first official trip to China as the Vice President of Zimbabwe, as well as the ruling ZANU-PF party. CCTV's Han Peng sat down with the man himself to find out more about Zimbabwe's economic turnaround.
Your Excellency, very honored to have you with us. Last August, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe visited China and signed 9 landmark deals with Beijing, which many people say have provided much needed support for Zimbabwe's economy, such as the key sectors like railway networks, energy, telecommunications, so on and so forth. May I ask, what is the status of these agreements now, and how do they tie in with your visit this time to China?
Realizing that Zimbabwe has been under constraint for the last 15-16 years, there is no area of the economy which you can say we are happy with. Every aspect of the economy has suffered from the illegal sanctions imposed by the EU and the West. So we are having a broad approach to the entire economy of the country to recover. Fortunately, the visit of President Mugabe, when he came here and he met the President of China, they agreed that China would assist Zimbabwe in reconstructing and rebuilding, revitalizing its economy. Now the duty is on us, the people on the ground, the ministers, the technocrats on both sides, to make sure we realize the vision of our leaders in that direction. Because of the size of those deals, they cannot come into fruition overnight. But I'm happy that several of them are work in progress, and some, like the South Kariba extension, is already making progress. It's under construction. We have the Wange 7 and 8. The bidding process has been done, and again a Chinese company has won that tender for the construction of a 600 megawatt plant in Wange. Then we have also in the area of infrastructure development, roads and railways network, which we need. In relation to railways, we need both the rehabilitation and refurbishment of our railway network. And with regard to the roads network in Zimbabwe, we need the dualization of those roads, as well as opening other new roads that we need to have. These deals will lend themselves to some model of financing. It depends on whether they're joint venture, they are build, operate and transfer, or they're joint ventures, and depending on the model of the deal, then the process is different.
How do you keep a balance of safeguarding the investors' interests while making sure that the local economy of Zimbabwe is being developed?
There has been an attempt, to a great extent almost succeeded by the West, to portray our indigenization approach as negative. Why do we have this indigenization? It is because we have gone over a period of 100 years when our resources had been taken by the British, the colonial masters, owning our own resources. So when we became independent, we wanted to unite our resources with us, the owners of the resources. So the resources belong to us and we belong to the resources. This is the theory we have as a people with regard to what I have said, depletable resources. But of course, we must know that investments can only go where it gets a return. So we must make sure we create an environment where investors are happy to put their money because they will have a return. So the question of indigenization frightens people because they read Western papers. But when they come to Zimbabwe, sit down with us, they will be more than happy to invest in Zimbabwe. And I can assure you that Zimbabwe is a good destiny for investment, whatever sector of the economy you may have in mind.
The European Union has been launching sanctions on Zimbabwe for a long time, but since 3 years ago, they've been trying to scale down the sanction on Zimbabwe. So what do you think is the reason behind their significant climb down on Zimbabwe?
The point is, in the first place, there was no reason, they had no reason to impose those sanctions. In terms of the United Nations Charter, sanctions can only be imposed on a state that is a threat to international security. Zimbabwe has never been a threat to international security. They are doing everything possible, finding some ladder to climb down by making various attempts. Say, oh, now we think that there is a rule of law in Zimbabwe, that it has always been there. So we have no concern about them. We will continue to move forward as a nation. We will continue to move forward with those who respect us, the countries who respect other nations like China.
Some say it is exactly because of the Western sanction on Zimbabwe that shaped the current ties between China and Zimbabwe. What is your take on that?
No, those people have very little understanding or knowledge of history. 60 years ago, no one thought about China to one day become a power it is today. It was a rural country, ignored by the West. But today, can you tell me which one single country on this planet which can ignore China? None. Everybody recognizes China is now the second biggest economy in the world. You have grown up. You have made your mark. How? Because you have resolved to develop yourselves. You have not depended on anybody but yourselves. And today you are a proud people. So, even us today, we are where we are down there. But as long as we remain resolute, united, peaceful, and stable, no one can stop development. With the support of countries like China, like Russia, like India, like Brazil, we are going to rise and be ourselves. We are not even thinking about East and West. We think about who is willing to relate to us. So during the days of hardship, which countries stood by us? This is where you find China is there. This is where you find Russia is there. This is where you find Brazil is there. This is where you find India is there. And many other smaller states stood by us. So we will always remember who are our friends. So we have no problem of, say, balancing. No. If the Americans want to come to Zimbabwe, the rules are set. If the British want to come, the rules are set. It's not anymore them setting rules for us. We set rules for them to come into our country.
If you'd like to see the full interview with Vice President Mnangagwa, you can find it online on the CCTV Africa YouTube page. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, our expert guest will help us unpack the benefits of Zimbabwe looking east. Stay with us.
We were struggling to liberate ourselves, the Communist Party of China, and the leadership of the late Mao Zedong supported us both politically as well as materially. And I'm going there now to discuss with the leadership of the People's Republic of China on how to implement, to facilitate, and to speed up those deals which our two presidents agreed.
That was Zimbabwean Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa speaking of the historic relationship between China and Zimbabwe, as well as his current diplomatic mission. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to broaden this discussion, I'm joined now by my expert guests. Here in Nairobi, we have Professor Israel Kodiaga. He is the Director of the African Center for International Studies. Joining us in Johannesburg is Ray Chipendo, Head of Research at Emergent Research Africa, and standing by in Beijing is Current Affairs commentator Victor Gal. Thank you all for joining us. Now, Professor Kodiaga, I'll begin with you. What is your understanding of Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa's current mission in China, and what is in it for Zimbabwe?
Thank you very much, Vanina. The visit basically is a follow-up from last year's visit of President Robert Mugabe to China, where they signed certain protocols where they agreed on certain areas of cooperation. So the Vice President, Emmerson Mnangagwa, is only going there to follow up on what had been agreed about. And in any case, this is his first official visit as the Vice President.
Ray, let me come to you there in Johannesburg and just build up on what Professor has said. President Mugabe did indeed visit China last year. But what's the significance of Mnangagwa's visit this time?
I think the Vice President has made it clear that he's following up on agreements that were made last year, and his visit is to work on implementations and timelines for the fulfillment of the agreements. So I think it's a very important thing. It's just a follow-up on that and to build implementation steps for that. I think it's also important when you look at the historic relationship between Zimbabwe and China, bearing in mind that in 2013, the national accounts show that there was 1.7 billion capital investment in Zimbabwe, and of that, 600 million was from China, which is a third of capital investment in Zimbabwe. So it's a very important thing, and I think bearing in mind as well the challenges that Zimbabwe is facing, most importantly from weakening consumption, which is traceable to the dilapidated infrastructure. And I think this is important, that when the Vice President comes back to Zimbabwe, he will come with some very actionable steps towards filling those infrastructure gaps.
Right. Victor, coming to you there in Beijing, Zimbabwe's ambassador to China, Paul Chikau, was quoted as saying during the signing of the MOU on Zim asset, and I'm quoting here, that what is exciting between Zimbabwe and China is what political relations can do to economic relations. And he says we want to see economic relations rapidly improving so that they are at par with political relations. So the question is here, Victor, what is political and economic context of Zimbabwe-China relations, and how far back do they go in recent years?
Thank you very much for having me on your program. I would like to point out that the relations between China and Zimbabwe have been very good for decades. China actually supported Zimbabwe in its drive for national independence, and ever since Zimbabwe achieved its independence, political relations between the two countries have been very good. And now this is a relationship very much based on mutual respect and non-interference in each other's domestic affairs. Economically speaking, everyone knows that there are economic difficulties in Zimbabwe, but from the Chinese perspective, Zimbabwe is very rich, not only in the potential for human resources, but also in land resources, natural resources, etc. And China stands ready on the term that China and Zimbabwe will agree to help the people, our brothers and sisters in Zimbabwe, to really generate the full upside of their potential as economic power going forward, if they can get their acts together. Now, from the Chinese perspective, we see some problems in the economic development area in Zimbabwe, but China, as a very humble country, is not in a position to lecture our brothers and sisters in Zimbabwe. We need to engage each other in a very peaceful and equal-based discussions, and the terms that can be generated out from that framework can be put to good use. And I would say that based on China's track record of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty over the last 37 years, China is in a position to help people in Zimbabwe to adopt a better economic development model, while without doing any harm to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Zimbabwe as a country.
Rain, let me come back to you there in Johannesburg. Now, Zimbabwe needs around $14 billion to rehabilitate existing infrastructure and generate or develop new capacity to meet growing demand, and that's according to the African Development Bank. So the question is, where does Zimbabwe get this funding from? Does the Look East policy does it answer this question? Is it the answer to these funds that Zimbabwe is seeking?
I think recently, incidentally, we put out a research note where we identified two key issues that we think need to be addressed in Zimbabwe to get back GDP growth rate to I think 2011 levels of about 10%, 9%. And I think those two things have to do with, A, as you well said, the reform agenda. I think this is an immediate requirement in Zimbabwe. And secondly, we pointed out to infrastructure. And these two are intricately connected. So let me just talk about the reform agenda. I think we are looking at A, the most important thing being the fiscal discipline or fiscal prudence in the way that the size of the government, how much is being spent, are we spending according to the receipts that we are getting. This is important when you look at the crowding effect of local borrowing that is being undertaken by government. So I think reform will remain one of the most important things that will get Zimbabwe back on the growth trajectory.
Professor Kodiaga, let me come to you. How ambitious is this transformation agenda, and what role does Harare envisage China playing?
Thank you. When you listen to the speeches, both from the Vice President, both from the Ambassador to China, and many of the party leaders in Zimbabwe, you can see a lot of excitement. And that excitement shows you exactly that Zimbabwe is looking at this thing from a very positive angle. But the political accolades notwithstanding, it is important to look at what ought to be the case as opposed to the political pronunciations. And in my considered opinion, the critical things that Zimbabwe needs to look at in the Look East policy, which is actually a conditional scenario, is one, they need to move the whole agenda of the China-Zimbabwe cooperation or relationship from party to party, take it to country, and get the people to have a buy-in, people to people. At the moment, it is more at the level of party to party. And when it is at party to party, then there is a disconnect with the people. Secondly, the relationship is asymmetric. There is need to actually move it from the asymmetric level so that Zimbabwe stops looking at the relationship merely from the political perspective, and China also looking at it from just economics. It's important that there is a balance there. As we move this relationship further, that we see that, one, the support that China is giving Zimbabwe on this thing and the whole corpus of the Look East policy is also viable and useful to the Zimbabwean neighbors, because if this was not happening and, for God forbid, Zimbabwe imploded, then the consequences and the ramifications will be heavier on the neighbors. Therefore, the countries neighboring Zimbabwe, the African nations, see this as a good thing because it is helping Zimbabwe stabilize during these very difficult times.
Right. Victor, let me come to you there in Beijing. This week, the two countries, Zimbabwe and China, signed a memorandum of understanding to accelerate the implementation of the ZIM asset. But in which ways will the signing of this MOU accelerate its implementation?
Well, from the Chinese perspective, we need to create a framework for the cooperation between two countries. In this particular case, between Zimbabwe and China, mainly because from the Chinese side, there will be many stakeholders to be involved in promoting China-Zimbabwe friendship and bilateral trade and political friendship, including state-owned enterprises and private enterprises and companies in various sectors, for example, as well as government entities, as well as NGOs. Now, as I mentioned, from the Chinese perspective, there is no reason why a country like Zimbabwe, with very rich natural resources, and if they can also achieve sustainable stability politically, and also achieve peace with the neighboring countries, and also gradually improving their international standing, and also work hard to make sure that Western countries eventually will lift the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. I would say if they can achieve all these conditions, plus helping hands from China and many other countries, then the economic living standards of the people in Zimbabwe can be uplifted significantly. And China has that track record. We know for sure if our political policies were not correct, economically there will be consequences.
Right.
Therefore, I think between China and Zimbabwe, we need to understand each other better, we need to engage each other better, and China will be very, very happy, as well as many Chinese companies and institutions will be very happy to work on equal terms with our friends in Zimbabwe on economic development, as well as promoting bilateral friendship in all aspects of the world.
All right, a very interesting conversation indeed. We've got to leave it there, gentlemen. That's all we have time for this week. Thank you very much to all my guests for being part of this show, and do remember to join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. I am Penina Karibe. See you then.